I used to believe we had one of those rare marriages, the kind that quietly worked, not flashy, not perfect, but solid. We had 2 kids, a house in the suburbs of Indianapolis, matching coffee mugs from our honeymoon in Sedona, and a well-oiled routine that made life feel stable, even if not always exciting. My husband, Jason, had a job in tech that required occasional travel, and I managed HR for a regional healthcare provider. We'd been married for 17 years. 17. That's more than half my adult life. I knew him like I knew my own skin. Or so I thought. It all started with something so small I almost didn't think twice. Jason had just upgraded his phone, and his old one was sitting on the kitchen counter. Normally, he wiped them clean before trading them in or handing them down to our teenage son, but that morning, in the rush to get the kids to school and himself out the door for another conference in St. Louis, he forgot. I was making a grocery list and needed to check a photo of a recipe I'd sent to myself. My phone was charging, so I picked up his old one instead. The screen lit up with a message. "Great seeing you again, babe. Last night was wild." It was from someone named D. Just D. I stared at it for a few seconds, long enough for the next message to arrive. "You left your cufflink in my bed again." My stomach sank, not because I thought he was cheating. No, it was worse than that. I didn't recognize the name. I didn't recognize the tone. I didn't recognize the person they were talking to, and more than anything, I didn't recognize the man I had built a life with. It felt like someone had just pushed me underwater and I couldn't breathe. At first, I convinced myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe it was a prank, a joke, or maybe, though I hated even thinking it, he was having a one-time affair. But curiosity is a relentless thing. I knew his password, of course I did. I'd never needed it before. Now, I opened the phone and fell headfirst into a rabbit hole of messages, photos, and hidden apps that didn't just suggest infidelity. They screamed it, and not just with one person. There were messages with multiple people, men and women, spanning years. Some of the names were saved under fake company contacts, others used code words. The depth of deception wasn't casual. It was calculated, deliberate, protected by layers of lies I didn't even know existed. I sat on the kitchen floor with the phone in my lap, reading through years of messages. There were weekends, he said he was at a cybersecurity conference when he was actually in Miami. Business dinners that were romantic getaways, airport layovers that lasted entire nights, and all of it logged, archived, and hidden right under my nose. That's when I found the second Facebook profile. Different name, slightly altered photo, but unmistakably Jason. He had an entirely different identity, a digital life that never crossed paths with ours. Different friends, different interests, even a different relationship status. Divorced. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My hands were shaking, but not from sadness, at least not yet. It was the shock. The realization that I had been living with a stranger, that everything I thought I knew, the small certainties that built our quiet little life, his tired eyes after business trips, the missed calls while he was in meetings, even the new cologne I thought he bought for me, were part of a performance. And the worst part? I hadn't noticed. Or maybe I had, in flashes. Maybe I'd just chosen not to dig too deep. That night, I couldn't sleep. He texted from his hotel, "Just landed, long day, miss you." I stared at that message for an hour. How many times had I smiled at texts like that? How many lies had I accepted simply because I wanted to believe we were okay? I thought about our kids, our home, the future I'd mapped out in my mind. I thought about how easily he told me he loved me every morning, and how effortlessly he must have turned around and whispered the same words to someone else by evening. And yet, in the middle of all that pain, there was something else. A fire beginning to burn inside me. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was clarity. Cold, sharp, unforgiving clarity. Jason didn't just cheat on me, he built a world behind my back and counted on me never discovering it. That meant he didn't respect me, he didn't fear losing me, he underestimated me, and I was about to show him exactly how big of a mistake that was. I didn't say anything to him right away. Instead, I spent the next few days in a fog of disbelief, moving through my routines like a puppet. I packed lunches for the kids, responded to emails from work, folded laundry, and smiled at neighbors during school drop-off, all while hiding the volcanic storm brewing beneath my skin. Jason came back from his trip on Sunday night like nothing had changed. He kissed me on the cheek, dropped his suitcase by the door, and complained about airline delays while I stood there in the kitchen watching him with new eyes. Every movement, every word, every glance. It all felt like part of a performance now, the way he rubbed his eyes as if jet-lagged, the way he asked about the kids' soccer games, even the way he offered to pick up dinner. It was all tainted, poisoned by the knowledge that he had been living a lie. I didn't confront him yet because I needed more. I wanted the full picture, the truth in its entirety, and not just what he would admit under pressure. If I was going to dismantle this illusion, I would do it thoroughly, brick by brick. So I began digging. I searched our shared desktop computer while he slept. I sifted through old credit card statements, looking for transactions that didn't make sense. There were dinner charges in cities he wasn't supposed to be in, hotel bookings under alternate names, gift purchases I never received. I found recurring charges from a luxury apartment complex 2 cities over. I Googled the address. It was a high-end building with gated access, concierge services, and a rooftop pool. When I called the complex pretending to inquire about a new lease, the woman on the phone casually mentioned that Mr. James Dalton, his alias, had been a tenant there for almost 4 years. 4 years. He had a whole other home. My stomach turned. What life did he live there? Who was he when he walked through those doors? Who else called him babe at that address? One night, while he was in the shower, I found his backup phone tucked into the lining of his travel duffel. It was locked, but I'd seen him unlock it once with his thumb. I used his finger while he slept. Inside was a digital world I had never seen before. Photos, texts, dating apps, encrypted messages. One conversation thread caught my eye. A man named Cole, whom Jason had clearly been seeing for years. They exchanged pet names, vacation plans, and even talked about the day things would finally be simple. I scrolled through hundreds of messages, one where Jason said, "I hate pretending with her, but I can't lose everything yet." I read it twice, feeling like the floor was giving out beneath me. I wasn't just betrayed, I was a prop. A placeholder, an obstacle he was biding his time with until he could escape clean. I copied every file, every image, every message. I emailed them to myself, saved them on a flash drive, then cleared the evidence that I had ever touched the phone. In those days, I stopped sleeping. I would lie awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, my body rigid with the effort of holding everything in. I looked at him, at his bare back, the way his arm draped across my waist in the early hours, and felt utterly alien. How many times had he touched me while loving someone else? How many lies had he whispered into my skin? I thought back to the years I spent wondering why he had grown cold in bed, why he avoided affection in public, why intimacy had felt so forced. And every time I'd asked, he'd given me the same excuse: work stress, deadlines, exhaustion. I believed him. I trusted him. That was my first mistake. Eventually, I started keeping a notebook, my own private case file. I wrote down every inconsistency I remembered over the past decade. I documented the business trips that didn't align with actual conferences. I tracked which weeks he claimed to be out of town versus the ones where apartment charges occurred. I started building a timeline. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that this wasn't a moment of weakness or a midlife crisis. It was a system. A second life meticulously crafted over years, one built on lies, excuses, and my trust. And worst of all, he was still lying to me every day, every night. Sitting across the dinner table talking about our daughter's math test while texting Cole under the table, laughing with our son about his baseball game while checking in on his second apartment. He was still choosing deception, still underestimating me, still playing the part. The tipping point came the night we had dinner with his parents. We were celebrating his father's retirement. His mother pulled out an old photo album and Jason made some snide comment about how boring married life could get, then laughed when his brother joked about men needing an escape. I smiled politely, but inside I was boiling. Was that what I was? A cage? A burden? Was that what he told them? I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at myself in the mirror. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Tired, hollow, silent. I pressed both palms to the counter and made a decision. I would stop hiding. I would stop pretending. He wanted an escape. He was about to get one. But not the way he expected. That night when we got home, I told him I'd be going on a work retreat that weekend. It wasn't true, but it gave me the space I needed. I booked a room under my name in a hotel an hour away. I needed time to breathe, to think, to plan. I took my flash drive, my notebook, my laptop, and laid everything out on the hotel bed like a detective at a crime scene. Because that's exactly what this was. A long con, a fraud, a 17-year scam in the form of a marriage. I reviewed my evidence, labeled files, created a folder structure, one for messages, one for receipts, one for photos. I started preparing a full timeline, a blow-by-blow of his double life. If he wanted to play dirty, I was going to show him what it looked like when I stopped playing nice. I wasn't ready to confront him yet, but I was getting close, and the best part? He had no idea. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still told me I was beautiful, still sent me "I love you" texts during the day, and I smiled. I smiled because every time he lied, I got stronger. Every time he faked his love, I felt more clarity. He thought he was living in two worlds, but soon he'd find out what happens when both worlds come crashing down on top of you. I was done being in the dark. I was done being the fool. He didn't just betray me, he underestimated me. And that was the last mistake he would ever make. I didn't know exactly when I would confront him, but I knew the moment would come. It had to. I couldn't keep pretending forever, and every time I looked at him, every time I heard him laugh with the kids or make some offhand comment about how busy work had been, it chipped away at the last remnants of the illusion I had once called love. But I didn't want to go into that conversation unprepared. I didn't want his lies to twist things or his manipulation to reframe the story into one where I came out looking like the unstable one. I had watched this man lie to friends, coworkers, even our children with such ease that it frightened me. He was charming, composed, always the rational one in any disagreement. If I didn't come with hard, cold proof, something undeniable, he would turn it around on me, and I refused to be gaslit out of my own reality ever again. The opportunity came faster than I expected. It was a Friday night. We had just put the kids to bed, and he poured himself a glass of wine and settled on the couch. I sat across from him, hands folded tightly in my lap, and said his name, calm, controlled, measured. "Jason, we need to talk." He glanced up from his phone, mildly annoyed. "Can this wait? I've had a long week." "No," I said. He set his wine down, sighed, and gave me that look, the one he always used when he was about to start some condescending lecture about overreacting or being too emotional. I didn't flinch. "I know everything," I said, and I meant it. The look on his face didn't shift immediately. He blinked once, twice, like he was trying to figure out what I meant. "Know what?" he asked slowly, carefully, as if picking his next sentence would make the difference between survival and disaster. "Cole," I said. "The apartment, the Facebook profile under James Dalton, the second phone, the trips that weren't really trips, the gifts, the dinners, the lies. I know everything, Jason." I watched the color drain from his face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. It was the first time I'd ever seen him speechless. For a man who made a career out of talking his way through anything, it was almost satisfying to watch him stumble, but only for a second, because what followed wasn't shame or remorse. It was calculation. His eyes narrowed, his expression hardened, and suddenly he sat up straighter, like he'd just remembered who he was. "Marissa," he started, his voice even and low, "I think you're jumping to conclusions. I don't know what you think you've found, but..." I laughed. It was sharp, humorless, and it cut through the air like a blade. "Jumping to conclusions?" I interrupted. "Don't insult me. I have screenshots, emails, transaction histories, photos, messages. I could print a binder and drop it on this table like a goddamn court case." He flinched at my tone, but he didn't back down. "Okay," he said slowly. "Let's say, for argument's sake, that some of that is true. It's not what you think. It's complicated." Of course it was. It's always complicated when the truth comes out and they're not ready to face the consequences. "You've been living a double life for years," I said. "You lied to me, to our kids, to your family, your friends. You've spent our money on another apartment, on other people. You cheated. And then you came home and smiled at me like nothing was wrong." He ran a hand through his hair, looked down at the floor, and finally, after what felt like a year of silence, he said, "I never meant to hurt you." It was such a tired, pathetic cliche that I felt almost insulted by it. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I repeated. "You lied to me for 17 years. You built an entire second identity. You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought I'd be too busy folding laundry and raising your children to pay attention. That's when the shift happened. His expression changed again, this time to something harder, colder. "So what?" he said. "What do you want from me, Marissa? Do you want me to beg? Do you want some big emotional scene? Because I'm not doing that." I stared at him, stunned. "I want the truth. I want honesty. I want to know how the hell you justified this in your head for so long. You were never really there for me," he said, voice rising. "You were always cold, always critical. You made everything about the kids, the house, your job. I felt like a stranger in my own home." That was the moment I knew. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even ashamed. He was rewriting history to make himself the victim. "You felt like a stranger because you were living a lie," I said quietly. "Don't blame me for the guilt you've buried under layers of denial. You had every opportunity to be honest, and you chose to lie, over and over again." He stood up then, pacing. "If you tell anyone about this, you'll ruin everything. The kids, our families, everything we've built. I don't want them thinking I'm some kind of monster." "Then you shouldn't have acted like one," I said. "You made this mess. I'm just the one who finally found the broom." He stared at me, and for the first time I think he realized I wasn't bluffing. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't yelling. I was calm, dangerous, decisive. "I'll make this easy for you," I continued. "We're done. I want a divorce. You'll leave the house by the end of the week, and if you try to manipulate the kids or twist the story, I'll make sure everyone you've ever lied to knows the truth. I have the receipts, Jason. Don't test me." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked cornered, not angry, not heartbroken, just caught. That night, he didn't sleep in our bed. He stayed on the couch, but I didn't hear him cry, didn't hear him apologize. He sat in silence, probably thinking of how to spin this into a narrative where he was the one wronged. I didn't care anymore. I had spent years giving him the benefit of the doubt, questioning myself, shrinking my needs to fit inside the life he designed for us. That ended now. The next morning, I started calling lawyers. I started separating finances. I contacted a friend who worked in real estate. I didn't wait for him to make the next move. I made it first. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence is where abusers thrive. It's where liars hide. And I had been silent for far too long. He tried to stop me from telling anyone, said it was private family business, said I was overreacting, said I was bitter. But I wasn't any of those things. I was clear, and clarity is a dangerous thing in the hands of a woman who has been betrayed, humiliated, and underestimated for nearly 2 decades. He didn't see it yet, but his world was already starting to unravel, and I wasn't going to lift a single finger to stop it. I was just getting started. After I confronted Jason, the air in our house changed. It was no longer filled with routine or familiarity. It was thick with tension, silence, and the quiet calculation of 2 people waiting for the other to make a mistake. We stopped talking unless it was about the kids. He avoided eye contact, mumbled half-hearted good mornings, and came home later each day, sometimes not at all. I didn't ask where he went. I didn't care. My focus wasn't on saving the marriage. It was on dismantling the illusion he'd created and making sure I came out of it with my dignity and my future intact. While he paced around in paranoia, trying to figure out how much I knew and what I planned to do with that knowledge, I got to work, quietly, relentlessly. The first thing I did was meet with a divorce attorney, a woman named Sharon who came highly recommended by a friend who'd survived her own nightmare of a marriage. Sharon didn't waste time sugarcoating anything. She asked hard questions, took meticulous notes, and looked me straight in the eye as she said, "If he's hiding assets or using marital funds to support another life, we'll find it. But you need to be ready for this to get ugly." I told her I was already living in ugly. She gave me a list of documents to gather, bank statements, tax returns, credit card bills, anything that could show a pattern of financial abuse or deception. Luckily, I had already started building my case before our confrontation, and now, with her guidance, I could refine it. I began assembling a dossier. I printed screenshots of text messages, emails, and social media posts from his alternate accounts. I organized credit card charges into categories: hotels, gifts, meals, rent for the second apartment. I matched transaction dates with fake business trips. I pulled security camera footage from our own front door, showing him leaving late at night on weekends when he claimed to be working overtime. I dug through our shared calendar and compared it to the lies he told me. The timeline formed with disturbing precision. The betrayal wasn't occasional, it was systemic. But I wasn't only preparing for court, I was preparing for war. Because Jason, despite being caught, still believed he could control the narrative. He began floating half-truths to mutual friends, planting seeds of doubt. "She's just angry," he told one couple we used to have dinner with. "Maurice has always had a temper." To others, he hinted I had mental health issues, that I was fabricating stories out of paranoia. The gaslighting didn't stop just because the marriage was over. If anything, it intensified. But what Jason didn't realize was that I had stopped playing his game. I no longer needed his approval or explanation. I was done explaining myself, done trying to be the reasonable one, and if he wanted to ruin my reputation to save his own, I was more than ready to fight back, with facts, not whispers. One of the most surreal moments came when I received a message from Cole, the man Jason had been seeing. It was short and simple. "I'm sorry, I didn't know he was married." He included screenshots of their conversations where Jason had claimed to be divorced for years, said he rarely saw his kids, claimed I was emotionally unstable, and had cheated first. Reading those lies was like peeling back the final layer of denial. Jason hadn't just lied to me, he lied to everyone. He built a version of himself that suited whatever room he was in, and adjusted the story depending on who was listening. And still, he had the audacity to walk through our front door and call himself a father, a husband, a provider. With Cole's permission, I added his messages to my file. I also started logging every interaction I had with Jason, just in case. If he showed up drunk, if he raised his voice, if he tried to manipulate the kids, I wrote it down. Time, date, details. I knew the family court system didn't care about feelings. They cared about patterns, proof, and presentation. And I was building all three. I even went so far as to meet with a forensic accountant, someone Sharon recommended, to trace large withdrawals and investments. The man was brilliant. In less than 2 weeks, he uncovered a secret brokerage account Jason had opened under his mother's name, funneling money into it for over 6 years. That money didn't come from his personal savings. It came from our joint account, disguised as retirement contributions and consulting fees. I remember sitting across from the accountant, watching as he highlighted the transfers on his laptop and feeling a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't just about the money, it was the audacity. Jason had believed he could get away with everything, not because he was clever, but because he thought I would never look. Because I had always been the one to trust, to forgive, to keep the peace. That version of me was gone, buried under the weight of his lies. I started dropping breadcrumbs to people close to us, not to gossip, but to prepare them. My parents, my sister, a few close friends. I told them enough to change the angle, to unmask the story Jason was trying to sell. I didn't go into detail yet, not until I was legally ready, but I made sure no one could look me in the eye later and say, "Why didn't you tell me?" I also sat down with the kids, one by one. I didn't give them the ugly version, but I gave them the truth in a way they could understand. "Dad made some decisions that broke our trust," I told them. "It's not your fault, and I'm going to make sure we're okay." They had questions, of course they did, but I answered them honestly, without bitterness, because they deserved that, because I was not going to let Jason's betrayal define their childhoods. The hardest part was seeing how easily he switched back into charm mode when others were watching. At a mutual friend's birthday party, he tried to hug me in front of everyone, tried to act like we were just figuring things out. I leaned in and whispered in his ear, "Every time you pretend, I release more of the truth." He backed off quickly after that, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he did something reckless. Narcissists don't like losing control, and Jason was starting to feel the walls close in. He still thought he could out-talk me, outmaneuver me, and maybe even guilt me into settling quietly, but he didn't understand what was coming. He didn't know that the woman he betrayed wasn't just hurt, she was prepared. He didn't know that every lie, every smear, every manipulation was now evidence in a case I had been building for months. I wasn't just divorcing him, I was exposing him, layer by layer, lie by lie. Every step I took now was a step toward reclaiming the life he tried to rewrite without me, and I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't broken, I was strategic, focused, relentless, and the truth was on my side. It didn't take long before Jason realized he was losing control. I could see it in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed whenever I entered a room, the way he began asking vague, probing questions that were meant to sound casual but were anything but. "Have you talked to anyone about us?" he asked one evening while putting away dishes, as if the question was just floating in the air, unrelated to the war happening beneath the surface. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence was its own weapon, and it made him nervous. That nervousness grew into panic when he was served the divorce papers. I made sure it happened at his office right before a team meeting, because I wanted the truth to arrive at his doorstep without a polite knock. The expression on his face, according to a friend of mine who worked in the same building, was pure disbelief, like someone had dared to challenge the version of reality he'd so carefully curated. He called me within minutes, voice sharp with forced calm, demanding to know why I was taking things public. I hung up before he could finish the sentence. From that point on, the gloves came off. Jason hired a high-profile lawyer, someone flashy and aggressive, and they came at me fast. Accusations of emotional instability, claims that I was alienating the children, suggestions that I was exaggerating everything out of spite. It was textbook, and I had anticipated it. What Jason didn't count on was that I had been preparing for this long before he even suspected. When Sharon and I walked into our first court appearance, I brought a thick binder labeled simply evidence. Inside were timelines, financial documents, screenshots, photos, and sworn statements. Every accusation he made, I countered with hard proof. Every attempt to twist the narrative, I straightened with facts. The judge saw through his theatrics almost immediately. He kept trying to play the wounded husband, the man who had tried everything to save his family only to be betrayed by a vindictive wife. But nothing he said could erase the paper trail. The turning point came when we introduced the forensic accounting report. Jason turned pale as the judge scanned the documents, asking pointed questions about the brokerage account in his mother's name, the unexplained cash withdrawals, the apartment rent. His lawyer tried to object, but it was too late. The numbers told a story, one even Jason couldn't lie his way out of. And then came the messages, hundreds of them, spanning years. The judge read them silently for several minutes before finally speaking. "This isn't just infidelity," she said flatly. "This is sustained deception, financial misconduct, and a clear pattern of manipulation." Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but still he didn't break. That was the thing about him. He didn't show cracks until everything around him was already falling apart. The fallout from the courtroom wasn't confined to legal consequences. It spread like wildfire through our social circle. People began to whisper and then to ask. A few who had once defended Jason reached out privately, apologizing for believing his version. Others simply faded away, uncomfortable with the drama, or perhaps ashamed they hadn't questioned him sooner. His family, however, was a different story. His parents had always adored him, their golden child who could do no wrong, and they clung to that image with desperation. His mother called me in tears, begging me to keep things private. She said it wasn't right to drag the family through the mud. I reminded her gently that I wasn't the one who had dragged anyone anywhere. I was just refusing to stay quiet about what had already been done. She hung up without another word. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks later when Jason's employer terminated his contract. I hadn't contacted them, someone else had. Maybe even one of the people he'd lied to in his second life, but the result was the same. When your company handles sensitive data and you've been caught living under an alias while funneling money through secret accounts, it doesn't look good. He tried to spin it as office politics when he explained it to our kids, but I didn't correct him. I let them see him scramble for once, let them hear the cracks in his voice as he tried to salvage his image, because the truth wasn't just being exposed in courtrooms and inboxes. It was seeping into the fabric of our lives, into every relationship he thought he controlled, into every person he underestimated. At home, the dynamic had shifted entirely. He was still there temporarily, dragging his feet on moving out, claiming he needed time to find a place. I gave him a deadline and watched as he ignored it, pretending that if he stalled long enough I'd change my mind. He didn't understand that I was no longer a woman to be negotiated with. Every day he stayed was another day I documented his behavior. Every passive-aggressive comment, every manipulative attempt to gain sympathy from the kids, every time he left dirty dishes in the sink as some petty act of resistance, I logged it all. And when he finally did move out, I changed the locks within the hour. I sent a final email to our shared list of family and friends, not dramatic, not emotional, just factual. I outlined the basics of what had happened, clarified that the divorce was a result of long-term deception, and made it clear I would not be entertaining further discussion. I attached a PDF with excerpts from the forensic audit and redacted messages, just enough to end speculation. The responses came flooding in. Some were supportive, some were awkward, a few were downright hostile. But it didn't matter, because the truth was no longer hidden, and I was no longer responsible for protecting the man who had destroyed our marriage from the inside out. Jason predictably called me the next day, furious. He accused me of ruining his life, said I had turned everyone against him. I listened quietly until he ran out of steam, then said, "You did that to yourself, I just turned the lights on." He didn't reply, he hung up. That was the last time we spoke directly. The divorce wasn't finalized yet, but the war was already over. Jason had lost, not because I wanted revenge, but because I demanded accountability, because I refused to let him walk away clean while I was left to sweep up the pieces, because I stopped prioritizing his comfort over my truth. In every way that mattered, I had already won. And what came next would be the start of something entirely new. Something built not on illusions or fear, but on the solid ground of a woman who had learned to stop shrinking in the face of someone else's lies. Once Jason moved out, it was as if a fog had lifted from the house. The silence he left behind didn't feel empty. It felt clean. The energy shifted. There was space again, not just physically but emotionally. The kids began to settle into a new rhythm, and I noticed how much more relaxed they became when they didn't have to walk on eggshells. Even the dog, who had always tensed up when Jason raised his voice, started sleeping soundly in the living room again. That alone told me everything I needed to know about the emotional atmosphere he had cultivated over the years. Still, the fallout from his departure continued to ripple outward, and I wasn't naive enough to believe he would go quietly. Jason's instinct had always been to control the narrative, and with his carefully crafted image now shattered, he was desperate to rebuild some version of it, whatever version he thought might still salvage his pride or his reputation. Within a week of moving out, he posted a vague message on social media about taking time for healing and reflection after a painful betrayal. I stared at the screen, momentarily stunned by the audacity. In his twisted rewrite, he was the one wronged. It wasn't enough that he had betrayed our marriage, stolen from our accounts, and lied to our family. He now wanted to wear the mask of the victim, hoping that people would pity him, or better yet, forget the truth altogether. But I didn't flinch. I didn't engage. Silence is powerful when you know the truth is louder than any fiction he can manufacture, and besides, people had already seen enough. The court documents were public. The financial evidence had been submitted and entered into record. The screenshots and photos I had shared with our inner circle spoke for themselves. Every lie he told now only made him look more pathetic. But Jason couldn't stop. He reached out to the kids repeatedly, trying to explain his side. He sent long, meandering emails filled with excuses, half-truths, and manipulative language. He told them that grown-ups sometimes make mistakes and that I had overreacted by going public. He said he still loved them, still wanted to be their father, and hoped they could move past all this drama. What he didn't understand was that children, even young ones, have an uncanny ability to see through insincerity, especially when it's wrapped in self-pity. Our oldest, Emma, told me plainly, "I don't want to talk to him right now. He's not being real." I didn't coach her to say that. I never told the kids to hate him. I simply told the truth and let them form their own opinions. Jason had spent years assuming he was the smartest person in every room, but now he couldn't lie his way back into their trust. Meanwhile, his other world, the one he had so carefully hidden, was falling apart too. Cole reached out again, this time to let me know that he had ended things with Jason for good. He'd found out about yet another set of lies Jason had told, this time about money and promises he had no intention of keeping. Apparently, Jason had even discussed moving in with him and starting a business together, claiming he had funds lined up that in reality didn't exist. When those lies collapsed, so did the relationship. I thanked Cole for the update and wished him well. I felt no anger toward him. He, like me, had been another piece in Jason's puzzle, a puzzle built on manipulation, not connection. But where I had been trapped in that world for 17 years, Cole had only lived in it for a fraction of that time. He got out. And so did I. Jason's professional life never recovered. Word had spread through industry circles faster than I could have imagined. He applied to several companies, including smaller firms out of state, but was either ghosted or rejected outright. Eventually, I heard he started freelancing under yet another alias, taking contract jobs online where he could hide behind anonymity. The irony of it all was staggering. A man who had built his whole identity on appearances was now forced to operate from the shadows he once used to deceive. He still had a few supporters, people who believed his version or simply didn't care enough to find out the truth. But even they grew quieter over time. The evidence was too strong, the paper trail too detailed, and his charm had worn thin. Through all of this, I focused on rebuilding, not just the practical things like adjusting finances and household routines, but rebuilding my sense of self. I started therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand how I had tolerated so much for so long. I needed to know why I had ignored red flags, why I had silenced my instincts, why I had worked so hard to maintain a facade that was never real. And therapy helped. It gave me language for the gaslighting, the manipulation, the constant minimizing of my feelings. It gave me a mirror that reflected not just what I had endured, but how much I had survived. And it reminded me that recovery isn't just about moving on. It's about reclaiming who you were before someone tried to erase you. I also found strength in the support of other women. Friends, colleagues, even acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to share their own stories. Some had been through similar betrayals, others simply wanted to say they were proud of how I handled everything. I began to see myself not as someone who had been victimized, but as someone who had taken back control. Every conversation I had, every time I said out loud what had happened, I felt lighter, not because the pain disappeared, but because the shame that had once lived quietly in the corners of my heart had been replaced with resolve. Jason no longer had power over me. His lies, his manipulation, his fake tears, they all meant nothing now. I had survived the storm, and now I was walking out of it stronger, steadier, and clearer than I had ever been. The divorce was finalized shortly after. The judge awarded me full custody, and Jason was granted supervised visitation rights pending further review. The financial settlement was in my favor, largely due to the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct. I kept the house, the retirement accounts, and the savings I had fought to preserve. Jason walked away with nothing but what he could carry, and in the end, that felt poetic. For 17 years, he had built an empire of lies, and now he had to live with the ruins. But this isn't a story about revenge, not really. It's a story about truth. About the power of one woman deciding she would no longer be silenced. About reclaiming the narrative from someone who thought he could twist it to suit his ego. It's about letting go of the idea that loyalty means tolerating betrayal. And above all, it's about showing every woman out there that you don't have to burn quietly when someone sets your life on fire. You can rise from it stronger than before, and you can make sure the world sees every spark that brought you back to life. Jason may have fooled everyone for a while, but in the end, the truth made its way to the surface. And it was louder, bolder, and more undeniable than any story he ever tried to spin. It's strange how quiet life becomes after chaos. After the storm ends, after the shouting dies down, after the lies have been dragged into the light and torn apart piece by piece, what's left isn't silence in the painful sense. It's peace. It's standing in the aftermath of everything that was supposed to break you and realizing you're still here, you're still breathing, and somehow you're better than before. In the weeks after the divorce was finalized, I found myself doing things I hadn't done in years. I took long walks without checking my phone. I repainted the living room a soft, calming color that Jason used to say made the space feel too feminine. I started cooking again, not because I had to, but because I enjoyed it. The house no longer felt like a stage I was forced to perform on. It felt like mine. Every corner, every drawer, every light switch had been touched by someone who no longer lived there. And yet, it was finally mine again. The weight that had lived in my chest for nearly 2 decades was gone. I began writing, not just journaling, but really writing. I started sharing parts of my story online, not the whole thing at first, just fragments. And to my surprise, the responses came quickly. Women from all over sent messages. They weren't just thanking me, they were telling me their own stories, stories of betrayal, manipulation, silence, and survival. It became a kind of community, one I hadn't known I needed. I created a podcast, something small at first, just a few episodes where I told parts of my experience. Then I began inviting other women to share theirs. It wasn't about exposing men or dwelling in bitterness, it was about reclaiming the narrative, about showing what strength looks like when it's quiet and determined, not loud and performative. The kids adapted better than I expected. They asked fewer questions as time went on. They saw the difference in me, in our home, in the way we now laughed at the dinner table instead of sitting in that strained, heavy silence. They still saw Jason occasionally, but the visits were awkward, brief, and usually ended with them asking to come home early. I didn't badmouth him. I didn't need to. Children feel what's real. They know who shows up for them and who doesn't. I focused on being consistent, open, and honest. And slowly, we all began to heal, not by forgetting what happened, but by no longer giving it the power to define us. One night, I sat out on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset. It was one of those evenings where the air is still and the sky looks like it's on fire in the best way. I thought about the version of myself from 2 years ago, the woman who would have made excuses, who would have let herself believe that silence was strength, who thought being a good wife meant swallowing pain so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. I thought about how long I let myself live in someone else's fantasy, and how easy it had been for him to write me out of the truth. And then I smiled, because I knew that part of me was gone for good. That version of me died the day I picked up his phone and saw a message from a stranger. What replaced her wasn't angry or broken. She was awake, she was clear, and she had rebuilt something far stronger than what was lost. Jason never truly apologized, not in the way that mattered. He sent a few hollow texts. He blamed stress, confusion, childhood trauma, everything but himself, and I let it go. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. I wasn't going to carry his guilt for another step in my journey. Let him live with the consequences of his actions. Let him explain to future partners why he lost everything. That story isn't mine to manage anymore. He wanted a world where the truth never caught up with him, but I caught up. And now, everyone knows who he really is. In the end, he built 2 lives, but I built one strong enough to survive them both.